Happy World Anglo-Indian Day. So this day, I believe, was declared in 1950, post-independence in India, to recognize the political status of Anglo-Indians in the nation. Both in the diaspora now, and I guess in India, it's still observed in different ways. Anglo-Indians don't have seats in the Lok Sabha like they used to. This was taken away by Modi. But they still have organizations, they still have political affiliations in India, across India. And solely in Bengal, there could be up to 50,000 Anglo-Indians or people of Anglo-Indian descent. Largely Christian, Catholic, Anglican, and other Christian denominations. The idea that Anglo-Indians don't assimilate is a powerful one in India, but not entirely true, because notwithstanding that they're a distinct cultural identity, many intermarry as well with, for instance, Bengalis. That's my knowledge. And also learn to speak Bengali, even if it's not their mother tongue. But in the diaspora, the sense of Anglo-Indian identity is one that's aging and not necessarily upheld by people of my generation or even more recent generations. Again, there are exceptions, and there are Anglo-Indian organizations in this country. So, in particular, in Perth, Sydney and Melbourne, there are strong numbers, and most Anglo-Indians arrived to Australian shores post-Indian independence and the partition in 1947. They had to cross the colour line of Australian immigration. Those that were permitted here were subject to those sorts of tests about how European you might be in way, in manner, in dress, in custom, in even appearance, right? And this is a tricky thing because within any Anglo-Indian family, there are those, or Anglo-Indian descendant families, there are also those who are of brownish shade or pale like me. That's not unusual. So the colour line and the walking of the colour line was a big deal because Australia was still under the sway of the White Australia policy, which was only rescinded by the early 70s in this country with the onset of the first wave of multiculturalism and a reimagining of Australian national identity. Still largely Anglo-centred, one must say, but not exclusive of people such as Anglo-Indians. So the possibility of an Anglo-Indian identity becomes much more possible, that's repeating, becomes much more prominent and comes to the forefront with the onset of multicultural policy in this country as an identifier. Largely, prior to that, there was the pressure of assimilation. So if you could pass as white, European in your ways, your manners, and not disclose your Indian heritage, that's what people would do to make their lives easier. Of course, that was also dependent on how you identified or not within sort of racial schema in this country. So being not quite white didn't mean that white passing wasn't a possibility. For example, for some members of my family who first immigrated out of India, actually pre-independence, so they really played up their status as being British subjects, and especially my grandfather, who was as pale as I am, but his brother was more brown, yeah? But as a family, they kind of got in under the radar of the Immigration Restriction Act, which also applied to Eurasians, and anyone from Asia, from Africa, from the Pacific, and even at that time other parts of Europe But the family law was aware of Spanish extraction. That's why we have the hair we have. That's why our facial features don't line up to the classic Anglo-Celtic ideal, even if we do also have Anglo-Celtic blood, right? So I'm not speaking for all people of Anglo-Indian descent here. People will have their own stories, but the force of assimilation was very strong and availed of by that generation that was also mobile through the circuits of empire. And yet my great-grandmother, Una, was constantly asked about her accent, for example, and one of her younger sons arrived to Australian shores only speaking Hindi. So it was quite a line to walk. I don't know the full story because it's not been written down. There's only traces of it in our oral tradition. Una speaking with a Chichi accent, which is a very derogatory phrase. And also some letters that we still have from the 1950s during the Cold War, when Una was well established here as a matriarch, and would make wry comments about European powers in Asia and how they should withdraw. So she basically supported decolonization. So I'm thinking about my heritage and also what it means to be of Anglo-Indian descent, or even Anglo-Indian Australian today. I'm not going to do anything in particular because the weather's shithouse. I could go to Darrell's up the road, which is actually created with an aura of the remnants of Britishness and empire and fusion with Anglo-Indian cuisine. Not that I'm a fan of pork vindaloo. I'm a vegetarian. But anyway, there's some reflections on this World Anglo-Indian Day. It's not an unfinished question. When people say that it's a dwindling or disappearing identity, I would say, which one do you mean? The one that critically upholds ideas of Britain as home, or that actually understands diversity in new ways?